Welcome, everyone. Hello, my name is Carrie. I have been producing content and working with speakers at Summit for about 10 years now, which is crazy. And I do have to say this is potentially one of my favorite sessions to ever come together on a Summit stage. And it has everything to do with how much I admire these two women I'm about to bring out. Dr. Orna Guralnik is the star of the groundbreaking show Couples Therapy, which please raise your hand if you've seen Couples Therapy. If you've seen it, you know that it is transformative and unique and special. And if you have not seen it, then I demand, as I do with all my friends and family, that you watch all 4 seasons immediately following this event because it is so wonderful. And you will quickly see why Dr. Guralnik has amassed a cult-like following for her work with patients on the show. In addition to her work on the show, Orna is a celebrated psychoanalyst who brings decades of clinical work to her practice. She explores the depths of human relationships and trauma. She's joined today by Jessica Yellin, who is a celebrated political correspondent. Jessica made the bold move to leave legacy media to start her own organization called News Not Noise so she could deliver information without the hysterics and the panic attacks. Jessica's audience spans the political divide and is even prescribed by therapists as a safe news source. So you might wonder why we've paired a political correspondent and a psychoanalyst, and that's fair. But the reason is that both Jessica and Orna, each through their own lens, confront the epidemic of connection that we're facing today. They explore the forces that shape our inner lives and our relationships and our community, and they shine a light on the barriers that keep us apart. I don't think I have to say why this conversation feels so timely to me. I'm sure it does to you. We live in a world of ever more connection, but emotional fragmentation. And Jessica and Orna are both doing the work in their own fields to figure out ways that we can authentically connect and understand ourselves and each other. So please help me welcome to the stage Dr. Orna Guralnik and Jessica Yellin.
Yeah, that's such a nice intro. What a lovely intro. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Carrie.
It's good to be here. So,
But who said they saw the show?
she wants to know who watches Couples Therapy. There you go.
Okay.
Are you comfortable with being on the other side of an interview? Because you're usually the one asking questions.
I got used to it.
Okay.
I got used to it.
Let's start with the show, because in my work, I try to change some of the way the media impacts people's mental health.
Right.
Do you think doing therapy in such a public setting on this show has changed the public's perception and relationship to therapy?
Yeah, definitely. That was, first of all, one of the reasons I wanted to do the show, which is to correct the way therapy is usually positioned on TV and in film. And there was recently a study that a group in LA actually did that found that our show has dramatically changed people's paranoia about therapy.
For the better.
For the better, yes. I think people both see that part of what I wanted to do with the way we did the show and the supervision sessions and the peer supervision sessions is to see that for people to be able to understand how therapists actually think and approach the work rather than just appear as this kind of omnipotent, all-knowing figure. And I think that helped dispel all sorts of myths about therapy. I think people see that it works. And I mean, this is not like scripted, it really does work, not with everyone and not always, but people see why it works. The idea is to demystify the whole process. And I think there's been like a big change in terms of how people perceive it. There's been change more among certain communities. Like I know somehow it's been like a very important show for the Black community, where there's usually a lot of suspicion about how therapists approach issues of race. Yeah, I think it's done a good job. I'm proud of it.
Yeah. Let's talk about the moment we're living in. We are constantly, especially at the end of a political cycle, bombarded with negative messaging and also being told that we are in a mental health crisis. So can you level set for us? Are we in an unprecedented mental health crisis, or is our perception of the crisis a little distorted?
Sadly, I think we are in a mental health crisis. I mean, I'm not saying it statistically. I'm talking about both sort of the number of people that are seeking therapy, but also what I see in my practice. I mean, I have an ongoing practice, and I see how my patients are struggling in the last few years more and more and more as things are escalating politically and polarizing. But, and hopefully we'll get into some of the factors, but, you know, mental health, when people talk about the mental health crisis, or they talk about like the teenager mental health crisis, there's some way that I think people sometimes think of mental health as ways in which like individuals are just like some kind of crisis emerges from within them and erupts into the world. But all of us are deeply influenced by what's going on in the world. So there is a multi-level crisis in the world we're living in, not only in the United States, but across the globe. We have like climate crisis like coming at us at the speed of light, like the sense of foreshortened future, where is this going? The sense that the people that are supposed to be taking care of things like our governments are at best helpless, at worst like doing everything against what we need. The parents, meaning the people in government, are fighting with each other rather than collaborating. The world, rather than collaborating all together to address these issues that are coming at us, is just going deeper and deeper into war. There's a sense that who is there to trust that will take care of this planet, of us? So when people talk to me about the mental health crisis, I'm like, the mental health is a reflection of what's going on in the world. It's not separate. So there's a crisis, and we're responding to it.
It's a healthy response to acknowledging the reality we're living in.
It is. There's no separation between the world and the psychology of the individual.
I work in the media, and part of what I try to do, my motto for my brand is, we give you information, not a panic attack. Because I've worked in the media so many years, legacy media, where it was designed to increase your anxiety. I'd say we compete for your anxiety deliberately.
Yeah.
What influence do you think the media has on our mental health?
Huge. The media, I mean, you know a lot better than I do what the media competes for. The media competes for anxiety, for attention, for number of minutes spent on each piece, on each article, for money spent after reading something. I mean, there's a lot of different aspects that the media is competing for that have nothing to do with like the well-being of the consumer, the reader. It ultimately translates down to how much money is spent on X, Y, and Z. So what ends up happening is the media, and the media is lots of things, right? It's social media, it's news outlets, it's what we read, it's like the shows we watch. The media mediates our relationship to reality. We don't have direct access to reality. We have what we're told. We have what we're fed and how to think about it. So how the media is portraying or giving us bit by bit pieces of reality will have the effect of how we feel, think, imagine the world we're living in. So there are many things to say about the media, and I'd actually love your description of it. But one important thing to say about the media is that it has dramatically split us so that we are each consuming a very different version of reality than others. And I don't know if it's split into 2 or split into 3 in the United States, but it's pretty binary.
Yeah.
So part of what's going on is that while we're living in the same world, we are actually living with very different versions of the world we live in, and versions that put us at war with each other.
Yes.
Thoughts
on
that?
I guess I would also add, after this election, we've learned that in a way we're living in a unique, it's like we each voted in a unique election because each of us was micro-targeted with information that was specific to us, that was different from the person we might be living with, and it could be a total reality distortion field.
I don't know if whoever's been to Jessica's talk earlier today, I was there, you gave some really interesting information. Do you want to describe like the way the targeted? I thought it was fascinating.
Some of what happened in this election was that if you were a black woman living in Michigan, a lot of this was done by Elon Musk, and he would micro-target to you information that would make you think that Kamala Harris is going to get rid of your favorite beverages and your favorite indulgences, like as a mommy state kind of reality. And if you're a more conservative person, it was going to be that she's like hyper liberal, and if you're a liberal person, she's too conservative. And it was just these, if you're Jewish, you would see Muslim, she's pro-Muslim, vice versa. And none of it was really based on actual policy. It was just an emotional valence. And it was borrowed from what a lot of we've seen in Vietnam and work in the Philippines, where bombarding people with disinformation drives the vote.
Yeah.
And it's seen now as a very effective way to win elections. It's not a partisan thing, it's just a strategy. But it also means that when you and I sit down to speak, I'm getting one set of reality, you're getting another, we don't share facts.
Totally, yeah. We're really living in very separate kind of tribal bubbles, or whatever you want to call it. And when people are talking to each other, they're not sharing the same background from which they're talking. It's kind of a pseudo conversation.
So let me ask you a little bit about conspiracy theories, because it's a topic we're all talking about these days. And research actually shows that social isolation increases rates of depression, but also susceptibility to conspiratorial thinking. Like if you're depressed or disconnected, you're more likely to believe disinformation and to share disinformation. And the irony is that our media ecosystem makes us depressed because we're constantly bombarded with negative information.
Yeah.
So we're primed to be open to disinformation. How do these issues present themselves in your practice, and how do you disrupt that?
Big questions. I think this might be a good moment to introduce. I was telling you that I'm going to introduce this psychoanalytic concept.
Yes.
I just started writing a piece for the Times about this. There is a psychoanalytic concept that I use a lot in my thinking, in my practice, in my writing. It's an old concept. It's one of the, I think, most powerful contributions that psychoanalysis has made. Originally by Melanie Klein. She was a British psychoanalyst, and she talked about the mechanism of splitting. You can imagine, for example, infants when they're very little and the world is very scary and overwhelming, they need to preserve some sense of goodness, so all of their bad feelings they project onto the environment, mom, for example, and try to hold on to the good feelings within themselves. And they really hold on very much to goodness separate from badness. But then when things flip, when suddenly they're like cold or hungry, or they're tired and everything is bad, suddenly they're all bad and the world out there is all good. So it's a very early kind of primitive mechanism that we all have within us, and we continue to resort back to it repeatedly in life when we're under conditions of threat. So you can think of it as our mind being kind of malleable, like we move between different states. We can be in a state where we feel secure and the world is a loving, benevolent place. Our alarm bells are down. We can see ourselves as decent human beings. We can see people around us as decent human beings. But then when we're in a situation where we're threatened, there's a sense of danger, we kind of resort to this splitting mechanism, or what we call excuse the jargon, the paranoid schizoid position. So that's a situation where you're on alert, you feel like there's danger everywhere, and you need to pull back. That's why schizoid. You need to pull back, defend your own, and see a lot of danger outside of you. And I think what's happening with the way that we're consuming, the way that news is arranged nowadays, because of all the factors that you've mentioned and the need to kind of grab attention, the news kind of sits, or the way media is selling us information, it sits perfectly on this mechanism, this paranoid schizoid position. So it's constantly pulling us into this position where we feel like there's us against them. There's danger out there, and we need to preserve the little bit of good to ourselves. So, migrants, or, climate is just a hoax, or this whole idea that we need to keep the little bit of good to ourselves and look at a lot of danger coming from outside. That is the essence of the paranoid schizoid position. And I think we're pushed into that state of mind constantly. And I when you ask me, I'm bringing it back to my patients. When my patients come into the office in a state of complete alarm or panic about the state of the world, and not all, but most of my patients are, let's say, liberal, and they start describing sort of the Republican Party as really demonic. Not that I don't feel that way sometimes too, but I really know how to organize my thoughts and kind of pick up on the cues of when we're like getting into this paranoid schizoid position. Then I remind people that we're all, for example, consuming news from a very particular sliver of the world, and that the demonic qualities that we see in the Republican Party are qualities that we can also find in ourselves if we just kind of relax a little bit and not do this splitting. So that's part of the work that I do with patients.
And you get them to be more integrated in the room?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I'm saying it sounds a little simplistic the way I'm saying it now. We can get into nuances of that, but that's the general direction.
I know you also work on personal and collective trauma and how that shapes relationships. Would you talk a little bit about that? I know it's big. You have to cover a lot.
Tiny little
not
topic.
That long. Take it wherever you want.
Yeah. Okay. I can say lots of things about that. It's one of the things I've written about over the years a lot, but it's very relevant to what's happening nowadays in the political world and the way we understand the political world. But typically you think of therapy, and traditional psychoanalysis, again, thinks of the individual as kind of a unit to itself, and maybe a unit that is influenced by early experiences with caregivers, with parents, like the family. But we typically don't think of the individual as part of this wider fabric of society and history, but we are. So, when you do deep psychoanalytic work with people and you spend enough time with them, you eventually come to understand that the way they perceive the world is not only influenced by, let's say, I don't know, their mother abandoning them, but also by things that were passed down from generations past. And the things that are passed down across generations are often big world events. So, the most immediate example would be, and I know it's trigger alert, it's going to, I'm sure, evoke all sorts of reactions in people, but the whole Israel-Palestine situation, where you're dealing with two people that are each severely intergenerationally and now traumatized, and you're trying to talk sense into them, and there's no way for any Palestinian or Israeli to be interpreting what's going on right now without the cloud of history that they're each carrying within them. So examples.
I know that in my work, when I report on this conflict, the comment section is just brutal, no matter what one says.
Yeah.
Because people are so emotionally charged over it.
And traumatically charged.
It doesn't feel like it's bypassed the brain. It's gone straight into the nervous system.
Yeah, well, it's an older part of the brain,
okay.
If you wish.
One thing I talk about in the news world is this idea of almost trauma fatigue. We bombard the audience with so much that's awful endlessly that at a certain point people feel like, I can't take it anymore. I got to go numb.
Yeah.
And I wonder, is that a real thing?
Yes. Yes, it's a real thing in the sense that, as I said earlier, we don't have direct access to reality. Everything, our reality is like completely way too overwhelming for our human brains, our miserable little cortex to process. So we're always to some degree trying to like deal with the beyondness of reality. So for example, when we process the news, there's a certain amount of misery, doom, tragedy, helplessness that we can think through, respond emotionally to. But beyond that, we are dwarfed. We are brought to our knees, and then we stop being able to process. It's not trauma the way being like, I don't know, at war or being assaulted is, but there's a certain kind of excess that overwhelms our capacity to make sense of things. And that's when we use defense mechanisms. And defense mechanisms can be, what I said earlier, kind of splitting and projecting all the bad onto the world, or it can be dissociating and just numbing out and like cutting away the impact of what we're hearing from our sense of who we are and what reality is. And I see that a lot nowadays, this kind of, you could call it trauma fatigue, you could call it meaning fatigue or fear fatigue. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, so my quick backstory is I was in legacy media forever, and I left and I started my own independent thing called News Not Noise, which is about giving you the news in a way that your nervous system can handle, so it's calm. But one of the pushbacks I get from the industry is, well, the negative stuff, the trauma stuff, captures attention, and that's what gets people to tune in. So you need that to be successful in business, right? To get the eyeballs. And I'm curious, my thesis has always been Hollywood's built on empathy, right? Like the entire movie industry is about caring.
Right.
So there are other ways to get attention. Are we wired to pay more attention because of the reptilian brain's response for fear and anxiety? Or is there a limit to what we should all be taking in every day?
Very good question. I think it's different kinds of attention. I think if you want kind of this like quick clickbait, like switch from this to that, then yes, you want to keep people anxious and fearful, and they will keep clicking in between things without like processing. And at some point they will numb out and cut out and, I don't know, go for a commercial. But there are other ways to engage the mind that ultimately are much more satisfying. And by the way, that's what our show kind of builds on. And the fact of the matter is people actually know that they need that and want that. They don't want just to be fed little clickbaits, pieces of like dramatic information. They want the space, the slowness to think, to have an experience. They need that. It's just they need to be offered that, which is hopefully what you're doing. How are people responding?
Well, one of my favorite compliments is when therapists say they prescribe my news for people who have a lot of anxiety. So it's a way people can take it in. It's also the case that there's some very, momentous things happening, and you can't like soften the edges always, right? So people they have to take in difficult news right now.
But I'm imagining that there could be completely different ways of like,
yes,
if I could completely revamp the way the news was fed to us, it would always be with complexity, rather than this like binary right, wrong, guilty, innocent.
It's nuance. And I also have found that acknowledging the human component is a game change. Like if you stop in the middle of a really difficult story to say, I know that this is triggering or this might be difficult for you to listen to, but keep going if you can. So you're acknowledging they're going to have a feeling. That allows people to stop holding their breath and feel. and they can get through it. So one of the pieces of advice I've always been given about, because I spend my day on social media, is when you see something that makes you tense up, instead of continuing to scroll, put the phone down and feel it. Like, let it course through you so you can process it and let it go. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm I'm having an association, kind of a somewhat of a non sequitur, but I think you read the piece in The Guardian that I did a series of very difficult conversations with, I'm part Israeli, and I did a series of very difficult conversations with a young Palestinian woman, incredible woman, who's like super pro-Palestinian, anti-Zionist. Like, the whole purpose of the conversation for her was to change my mind and convert me into like complete anti-Zionism, which she almost succeeded. But we had a moment in which, for example, we were talking about how we come from very different news sources. We have a completely different version of history that we learned about each other. And I asked her to once in a while show me what the news she's consuming. And many of our sessions, she showed me like incredibly upsetting videos from Gaza. And what we would do is she would show me, let's say, some horrible situation with children being murdered and operated on without anesthesia, and like really just like to die, harrowing situations. And then we would put it down, and then we would talk about, first of all, how we're feeling in our body, extending a certain kind of space and care and empathy to each other, aware of the fact that this exceeds our capacity to really make sense of. If we just moved on from it and just, attacked each other for it, it would be useless. It would just be continuing the same cycle of, in a way, violence, inflicting violence on each other. So we made sure that every time things were super overwhelming, we just slowed things down and paid attention to like the most minute kind of feelings, how all of this is impacting us. Time to like feel the body, time to cry, time to apologize for what we could, like just make room for like what this piece of news means for each of us.
Well, what that brings to mind for me is so much of, especially that story is about narrative, and that the media can play into one narrative or another, and then you bring the whole baggage of that narrative with you, no matter what the facts of the moment are.
Right.
And so stepping out of some global story and into your present moment probably has power.
And learning about the different narratives.
Right.
Really learning.
I mean that I've tried doing that, where you present both narratives and both sides scream at you and want to cancel the subscription.
It takes
It's
time.
very dangerous.
It takes time.
Yeah.
This whole thing of like assuming that we can do this living in this very complicated world situation we're in, that we can do it quickly, is false. It's the only benefiting factor here is probably the market and the few people that are benefiting from the market. But the rest of us are fucked if we don't take the time.
Right. A lot of people are benefiting from the market, but not the majority.
Well, I'm talking about the
very,
sliver
very
up there.
tough. Yeah. So the two questions I really am dying to talk to you about are, one, how do we talk across differences like this? I mean, whether it's everybody going to Thanksgiving soon and having to sit down at the table with a family member who's dug in on their position that they disagree with, and they either don't want to fight, but get into the conversation, or if it's a family member who's really gone down the rabbit hole on disinformation and you want to help them out, what are the tools?
Yeah. Do you know the work of Gillian Laub?
Mm-mm.
She's a photographer, an amazing photographer, and she did this series that's coming out both in the media and eventually in a film called Family Matters. Her family is like, Jewish family, very super Trump supporters, and she's like super liberal, and it's a lot about the Thanksgiving dinner.
Fun.
So I think the way I've been in many situations where I help people try to move through these like very difficult situations where they're coming at each other from a super different perspective. I mean, obviously I do that in couples therapy, but here we have like the density of like the political situation we're in. And what I advise people to do, I don't just advise them, I kind of hold their hand and help them kind of orient their mind towards, is to not rush towards a solution, trying to, for example, influence their, I don't know, their relative or their partner about how they're thinking, but move into the position of listening and trying to understand, which is literally like we're using a different part of our brain to do that. I mean, there's the part that has to do with like speech and the part that has to do with comprehension, and they're different. And putting yourself in the mode of comprehension rather than in the mode of convincing is hugely helpful. And not because you then need to be convinced yourself by what you're hearing, but you're creating an atmosphere of friendliness.
Where they feel heard.
Yes, where people feel the issue, the point of the conversation is to understand rather than fight. And if eventually you're going to influence each other in one way or another, maybe, that happens a little bit. But if you create an environment of friendliness where you're interested in each other's perspective, you've gone 75% of the way. And what does that mean? Like, if someone is coming at you with a position that sounds completely obnoxious or crazy or offensive, rather than in your own mind fight with that and talk to yourself about like how obnoxious that position is, start asking, what this person that I'm talking to, why does that matter to them? They're obviously not a bad person. Most people are not bad people. Most people are just think the way they think, and they're concerned about certain things that might not be your own concerns, and again, they come from a different history, but try to understand what matters to them and try to give them the feeling that you're following it, that it matters to you what matters to them. You don't have to agree at all. You just want to know what matters to them, really, emotionally what matters to them. Why do you want to cancel affirmative action? Why? What is the issue? In what way does this really irk you? What in the background? Let's say we're not assuming you're just a racist. Like what really matters to you there?
Yeah.
And you're creating then a very different atmosphere, because once people are heard, they can relax a little bit, and maybe they will actually be interested in doing the same and listening to you, what matters to you. And then you'll find, we're all more human than we thought.
And you don't argue with them. None. You just...
I try. It's hard. I'm half Israeli. I know how to argue, but it's really a different state of mind.
It's deep listening. Almost
It's
like
deep
AA, where you just let them
listening.
talk and you don't comment. Just
Deep
let it...
listening. It's more than don't comment. You try to put yourself in the other person's shoes and relate to them as a person with their own center of subjectivity, with dignity.
One more on this, because I think it's helpful, is I was told you don't challenge people's facts, you ask them questions with the idea that maybe they'll leave turning that question over in their head, so that you're not in conflict, you're curious.
Well, again, I would ask, what is the purpose of the conversation? What are you trying to achieve in that particular conversation?
Convince them that they're an idiot. No, sorry.
Believe me, I know what that feels like. But let's say you suspend that objective. And you go bit by bit, and you first want to create an atmosphere where you're not at each other's throats.
So it's not goal-oriented. You're just present to
Well, that
hear.
is a goal. I mean, to create a situation, like when I was having this like ongoing dialogue with Christine, she had the objective of convincing me I'm an idiot, but ultimately the purpose of our conversation was to connect with each other, like have kind of a deep empathic connection in a way that we stopped experiencing each other as demonic enemies.
Right.
And that then opens up, I mean, the human race has many qualities, but one of the qualities we have is we have the capacity to be incredibly creative, amazing problem solvers. If you create the conditions for the mind to work that way, we could do that. If we're just like at each other fighting and arguing and trying to convince, it's just, this is what it looks like. It's just like ongoing destruction. Can I just ask
Yes.
you, though, as a journalist,
Yeah.
how does that sit with you? Like when you interview people, does this track? Does this...
Well, there's two different, I mean, there's the way you interview somebody, and then there's the relationship you have with how you communicate to the audience.
Right.
I think that
How is it?
different.
Yeah.
In an interview, it depends if it's a combative interview or if it's just trying to draw a person out. And the best interviews are where you go in with a plan and then you develop this where you're relating to the person and it goes in its own course. It just takes off.
Yeah.
And so you're hearing and responding. I love those conversations because they're curiosity driven. They lead to vulnerability. People feel the connection and they feel connected. But when you're in TV news, you have to get a bite. You got to get that bite. That's why in the briefing room, half the time, in the White House briefing room, I was a White House correspondent, half the time it's about the question and how combative you are in asking it. I mean, I think this is one of the problems in our public discourse, is that the way we model political discourse in particular is conflict. Whether it's us versus the White House or it's a panel of pundits screaming at each other, it looks like to be engaged means to fight and hate the other side. Because that's what TV or print looks like.
But why?
Well, I mean, that's my speech. It's basically a long time ago, especially TV news saw that it went from being a loss leader, news didn't make money, to news started making money when it was gotcha journalism. And they're like, well, this is a way to get profit. And then it metastasized through the industry from taking what 60 Minutes did really well into just combat on panel discussions, never allowing two panelists to agree because that's bad TV. They have to fight. And so we've modeled this like high cortisol fight or flight, always in, fear and panic mode as the standard for TV news, especially. And it's infected all kinds of media now. And that's what the algorithms are tuned to on social media too.
Totally. And that it creates that state of mind. It's like a paranoid, schizoid state of being. It's terrible.
But you've explained, they say that there's something about social media that primes us to believe conspiracy theories.
Right.
And I think it's what you were talking about.
Paranoid schizoid. Yeah, paranoid schizoid. It's like, I mean, I think of, excuse me if I'm offending people, but I think of conspiracy theories as verging on psychosis.
Really? I like them. But I know, but they're just intriguing. I don't buy into them.
Would you like to tell me about
I know.
What do they mean to you?
Later.
But this paranoid schizoid position, it does, I mean, in extreme states, it does lead us to psychotic perceptions of reality. So,
Spend enough time in the news and you start to think you might be.
okay.
My other big question is, I covered COVID so intensely, and we were all locked in our homes, and there were people dying, and everybody was fighting, and there was all this rage around it, and it was a collective trauma. And then lockdown ended, and we all went out and went back to our lives as if nothing happened. And my just intuition is that part of the reason we are so polarized and reactive and angry is because we never process the trauma of this experience.
Yeah.
And thank you. And And we're so controlled and unwilling to show public vulnerability.
Yeah.
Does that compute? And if so, how do you create an opening, or what's the way to create vulnerability in community?
It's a big question. You know, I want to add a piece to the COVID interpretation. I mean, I think one of the things that happened in COVID is not only that we were all rendered incredibly vulnerable, our vulnerability was exposed. I mean, who knows, like, who's getting it? Can you die from it? What is this? Is your neighbor going to infect you with something? I mean, a lot of like very scary fantasy scenarios were coming to mind. And the proximity to death. But what also happened during COVID is there was a moment where it seemed like maybe we could move towards all of us working together. For a minute, it looked like, oh my God, this is going to be, we're going to learn how to function as a global community, which will then hopefully prepare us to deal with climate. But that all just broke down into like all this like crazy fighting between the pro-vaxxers, anti-vaxxers, like, is it real, is it not real? It just became like, you know, a shit show of like us against them. And I think that left a deep feeling of, again, there's no parents, there's no one taking care of the whole thing. I mean, we're just in a family falling apart. So I think that's part of how I see the remnants of COVID with us. And in terms of how does a group move through trauma or move through difficulty? I mean, unfortunately, the trauma is continuing because it's just escalating with what's happening in the world now, between like what's happening in this country, the wars that we're all part of. But what we need is we need to go through a process of acknowledgement of what happened, acknowledgement of where things went wrong, mourning, and slowing things down. I mean, we got to move out of this paranoid schizoid position.
In a practical sense, does that mean if somebody's a CEO or they manage a team, does that mean that they start off with a how are you feeling check-in? Feels like in these days you're not allowed to ask personal questions of your employees. Like, how do you implement this?
First of all, people are asking, how are you feeling? People are asking more, how are you feeling? How are you feeling? I mean, one of the things when I sometimes work with people, like with CEOs and people that are trying to figure out how to like manage their organization, and people more and more are trying to speak directly to what's going on rather than shoving it under the carpet. Saying something about, I know you must be suffering with this or that anxiety. It's post-election, I'm sure a lot of you are having very difficult feelings nowadays, or some of you are elated and some of you are not. Around the Israel-Palestine, not hiding from what's going on, but making statements that make room for people to acknowledge that there are multiple perspectives and there are lots of feelings that accompany those. Just like create a space, like a holding space, to know that these things are actually happening.
Right. So we can acknowledge our reality before going to work. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the themes I've heard you bring up a few times is this collapse of trust in authority, whether it's COVID or our political environment, et cetera. The sense that the people who are who's supposed to fix things, when are they going to fix it, aren't doing the job. And so it's almost like we have these existential burdens on ourselves to make every decision, and they are increasingly high stakes decisions, whether it's COVID and your family's health or the political environment. I see this manifest in my world because I get my audience constantly asking me, is this true? And I'll say, I'm going to tell you the answer, but I'm going to also give you the words you could use to Google it. So I'm like, basically like, you could Google it. And they're like, no, I know how to search, but Google will return 20 million responses, and I don't know how to know what's true. So there's this like complete collapse of faith in their own ability to discern.
Yeah.
And so they've lost faith up there, and they've lost faith in here.
Totally.
And my instinct is something about this, the solution is community. I don't know.
I will think with you about it, but now you brought me to the point where I was like waiting to ask you something.
Oh, no.
Okay. As the person of the mediator of reality. How do you think of truth?
Talk about a big question.
I know. But how do you think of truth in terms of like anything from like when a piece of news arrives at your desk, like how do you think of truth? How do you think of what news to put in front of the other? How do you think of what story to tell, and what's more true and what's less true, and what's a subjective way versus an objective way? Like, tell me, it's like...
So there's a lot in there. One is, obviously I don't think there's an objective truth that we could all know. Everybody has a come from. So you have an obligation, I think, increasingly to be transparent with the audience what you're coming from, like what your limits and positions are.
Do you have an example?
When I used to work for CNN, I was just a blank slate, right, publicly. Now I tell my audience I am a person who believes that women should have access to full reproductive rights. Mm-hmm. And I will give you all the facts on the abortion debate, both sides, all the sides, but my personal strongly held view is this. So they know that.
Awesome.
Or on gun safety or the environment, I'll say I believe in climate change, mm-hmm. I believe in the science.
But you will then also report...
I'll report other arguments.
Yeah.
I won't give it false credence. For example, there are scientists I believe and trust, and if they tell me that's the science, I will reflect that.
Yeah.
And if there are people over here who give me things that are not science, I will not elevate that.
Yeah.
But I tell my audience that. If you want that stuff, go get it somewhere else. So my view is to be clear about that with your people. To acknowledge things like during COVID, a lot of women were getting the vaccine and were not getting their period for a while. And the medical establishment was like, that's not true. And I'm like, I have a million women in my audience who are saying it's happened to them. It's true.
Yeah.
So that was not condoned by the scientific community, but I reflected it because I had this universe of people who were telling me this.
Yeah.
So I think those conversations are important. As a journalist, you have a deadline. And you have to tell truth as best you know it by deadline.
Right.
So what that means is collecting as many perspectives on the thing as you can in a limited amount of time and conveying that to the public.
When you're conveying it to the public, are you aware of ways in which you're trying to influence?
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah. No, good.
I mean,
good.
And it depends on the story, right? Some stories, it's much more that.
Yeah.
Where everything's shaped in a way. When I was in legacy media, this is the thing people misunderstand about legacy media. They are mostly not truly ideological, at least TV. They're biased toward ratings. They want to juice the thing to have the highest stakes and trigger the most anxiety, fear, rage, outrage, whatever that reptilian emotion is. So it's not about right or left. It's about getting you to stick around.
This is a disaster.
I agree. That's why we need to reform it. Yes. Yeah. And that's what the algorithms are tuned to as well, unfortunately.
I'm just looking at the clock, and we never got to ask people questions.
You do it.
Does anyone have any thoughts or questions for us?
We're making a special exception. There's one. We're not supposed to ask you questions, but we're going renegade.
You have to speak louder.
I'll repeat it too.
I am a therapist. I'm in a bunch of therapist chat groups, and what's coming up is there's a lot of divisiveness since the election about Emor, about their political beliefs, and if they should bring them into the therapy group. And
Whoa.
It's huge.
Let me repeat the question before
Okay,
you answer,
great,
and then we
great,
can
great.
She said that she's a therapist, and she's in a lot of chat rooms with other therapists. Let me know if I'm getting this wrong. And she's found that therapists are disagreeing about whether or not they should bring their own politics into the therapy room, and whether it's okay to fire clients who hold a different political position. Is that correct? Okay.
Great question, huge question. I'm just going to give a skinny response that's just true for me. I think patients are very tuned in to their therapist's politics. Like when people walk into my office, they know a lot about me. They know what class I belong to, they look at the art I have, they look at my books, they know a lot. Similar to what you said earlier, Jessica, in terms of like that you're not speaking from nowhere. When I talk to my patients about politics, I make gently clear that I'm not speaking from nowhere. So if I'm having like a strong reaction to something they're saying, and I know they're going to pick up on it, I will own it. But I will not own it in a way that I want them to feel like me. I will own it in a way that I will open a conversation in which mostly I'm trying to understand what's going on with them while owning the fact that I'm having a reaction, that I have my own political reaction. Now, I work with people that have different politics than me. Not a lot, but some. And really, every person has, to some degree, different politics. And some of the time, it's really about, again, just what I was saying earlier, it's about like creating a space where there's room for multiplicity, because that always helps everyone. And some of the time, I know in the back of my mind, this is a political perspective that I think over time in therapy will change. For example, when people are extremely misogynistic, I'm not going to be able to address it head on, but I know if they spend enough time like understanding their own history and sitting with me, it's going to change. It's like a symptom. Their politics are more like a symptom. So
I love that. I wish we had time for more, but that's our time. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
you
you
all.
so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica.